Good morning. Welcome to the Winchester School Committee meeting, February 26th, 9:30 in the morning at the Parkhurst School. Quick rundown of our agenda: public comment under item number 3, reports and discussion. We're going to revisit the FY20 budget. We've got two budgets: the no budget austerity budget, hi Sam, and our needs-based budget. I'll share with the committee what happened at the FinCom meeting last night. We're going to review very quickly some process associated with the superintendent's evaluation. Under item 4, action items, we have approval of minutes and 2 grant approvals from INCA and from Cambridge Hospital for Nursing Professional Development. We have a chair report, superintendent report, and the need for an executive session to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining for B, C, and D units, since discussion in open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining or litigating position of the committee. And then our next meeting dates are March 5th, 19th, April 9th, and then we will adjourn. So, Sam, I know you just walked in the room, but what I would like to do is pick up, is there anyone here for public comment? Karen, any comments from you today? Thank you. Karen's an observer. Seeing no other public comment. Let's kick off with a discussion about FY20, and I would welcome you and Nicole to the table, if you don't mind. Let me take a moment to sort of just review and summarize for the committee, obviously, what's happened since the last time we met. So the select board met, it was the Thursday break. There was a motion for a $8 million operating override rather than 10 plus 2 for capital, so an 8 plus 2 in lieu of a 10 plus 2. That motion passed unanimously. There are some consequences of that. Obviously, $2 million less means it will sustain us for less time, and or it means for the same period. If it's a 3 or 4 or 5 year solution, one has to do less with less money. There was some discussion about free cash that would be tied to that model. And then the next day, the town manager produced her budget, which you all have access to and is available online. The town manager's austerity number is consistent with what we voted on January 8th. Her, what we call yes vote or needs-based budget number tied to the override is less than what we voted. And so the superintendent has come up with some suggestion based on some new information that she can share with us today that may help us get closer to that number. So that's an important part of what we need to talk about today. But there are some other elements I think that are important for us to discuss. So one is really sort of philosophical, right? So if there's less money associated with a yes vote on an override, how comfortable is this committee talking about what we can and will accomplish, like in year 3? We've talked about stepping up our investments in full-day aides for kindergarten in over 2 years. How comfortable are we with that? There has been so the Finance Committee last night in their meeting, let me pivot to that, and you guys jump in if I misstate anything. So the Finance Committee, as is typical of their process, they need to vote the various budgets of departments to sort of prepare for town meeting. And this year, as you know, we have 2 budgets. So town meeting, FinCom met last night for a couple hours on education. They voted the austerity number. There has been some question about the winning farm money, which we've all been joking about for a year, has already been spent 100 different ways by 100 different people. It was confirmed that the winning farm, so first of all, the check has come in, it's been cashed. That revenue is not reflected in the report. However, there are some expenses as well that may be not yet reflected in that report. And I would summarize FinCom's position on this. So the question was, in a no vote scenario where we're facing layoffs, and we've all acknowledged then the first step on the day after will be some conversation about the need for another override, because the cuts in 20 are nothing compared to what has to come in 21 and 22, because we need the revenue because the expenses keep going up. There has been a question about whether that winning farm one-time source of revenue in any way should be considered in the austerity piece. And my sense from FinCom last night was not right now, first of all, And if so, maybe, but later, and certainly not all of it, given all the other needs that we have across the town, both on the operating and on the capital side. So perhaps after the override question comes, but before town meeting, that might be something FinCom would be willing to look at. So it's not anything that would substantially change the impact of the austerity budget and the consequence of no. Is that a good summary?
I think so. Just one thing I wanted to add, the Winning Farm revenue isn't reflected because of DOR policy around how that revenue has to be accounted for. So just to clarify, it wasn't intentionally left out for any reason other than accounting rules and how it has to be accommodated. So the town comptroller is well aware that the funds are there. It will get updated as part of the process closing out FY19 and then can be appropriated. But to Chris's point, we had a lot of discussion in FinCom about what should we do with that money in terms of how we're modeling both a non-override and an override scenario. But we didn't want to include that revenue source and not include any associated expenses. And we've heard a number of different projects associated with that funding. And I won't even bother with the litany of them, but there's a lot. From a personal standpoint, our yellow sheet reflected a $2.3 million use of free cash at Springtown meeting of 2018. So for FY19, we plan to use $2.3 million of free cash to balance the budget, hoping that some of that would be returned with reversions at the end of the year. But we are currently forecasting that has increased by almost $1 million. We're forecasting $3.2 million of utilization because of extra legal costs, the normal snow and ice usage that we see as part of the process. So for a number of reasons, my comment when Chris and I spoke about this was, we've actually already spent the Winning Farm money before we've even started. That money just puts us back to where we were at the start of the fiscal year. And so for that reason, I personally was opposed to trying to allocate that funding to something now. And I think that was echoed by the rest of FinCom last night as we discussed it as a group. Do you want to add anything?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, certainly we'll have a lot more information once the override vote takes place, and also once we see some of the warrant articles for Springtown meeting as well.
Good point.
Because a lot of that $1 million increase in use of free cash from when we voted on the FY19 budget and what we're seeing now for usage came from Fall Town meeting warrant articles as well. So that's a lot of times where that money goes.
One other piece that came up that I thought was interesting last night was a question from some members about why it is in an austerity scenario as a consequence of a no vote that we see increases in schools and negative budget growth in other areas across town, contraction in the budget. There's certainly an acknowledgement of our mandated expenses associated with the kids that we have, but I want to give our town manager a lot of credit because she was quick to point out that much of what's shown negative in other cost centers, think about crossing guards, think about cuts like in custodial staff, actually impacts the schools. So I thought Lisa did a good job of kind of reframing that for everyone, and I appreciate that.
I think the other point that she made that I think is important for school committee to understand too, so to Chris's point, the question came up, why are we seeing a 3.8% increase for schools in an austerity model and negative impact on the rest of municipal? Is that fair? And so part of what the town manager also addressed, we lucked out, she happened to have stopped in for about 15 minutes and it was during this conversation. Part of what she also shared was the other, to Chris's point, most of those cuts are school related, but the few that aren't, like having one less police officer, she said if there's a need there, we can cover that with overtime. Yep. Whereas obviously with a teacher, you can't staff a class through overtime for a teacher. And so I thought that was an important point of we've got a little more flex on the municipal side in terms of how we staff positions that obviously doesn't exist in a school atmosphere where you have kids in a classroom that have to have a body physically with them.
I'm glad you mentioned that because there was actually a question directed to me about whether we could ask our teachers to work fewer hours during the day. Could some teachers work, part-time? Can we scale back? So we had to have some conversation about salary employees get certain benefits and a collective bargaining agreement. It's a good discussion. So
well, you could have some part-time kids.
We shared. It was a
school.
productive conversation, and we shared some good information.
No
so
bad questions.
What's that?
No bad questions.
There were no bad questions. It was good, not combative at all. So I think that buttons up austerity. Oh,
Well,
you
and
guys-
I just wanted to, so I think we're probably heading in the same direction. So FinCom voted favorable on the austerity budget last night for education. And
one dissenter.
with one dissenter,
Yeah.
thank you for some questions. As we look at the override scenario, the other tone from FinCom last night is we very much want to try to make, if an 8 million operating and 2 million capital override should pass, we want to try really hard to stretch that as long as possible. So I think the select board went into that thinking it'll cover us for, at least 2 years, maybe longer. So we're absolutely looking at it as how do we try to make that money stretch as far as possible? And what does that mean? So we've got some work to do in modeling some different options and what that looks like. But I think the message that came back from FinCom to Chris to translate to all of you was to please think about how much do you really need in FY20? And respectfully, I understand, you need all of it, but what are the must-haves and what are the implications for FY21 and FY22? So that as we look at the modeling, we can get a better sense of how long do we think the numbers last. So the implications there are trying to understand your priorities. For some of those ads that you were trying to push out, do they still get pushed out? Do they get pushed out further? Do some of those get eliminated? So what happens as you look out even beyond FY20?
Yeah, so I mean, a major thing for us was there had been so much analysis put into the 10 and 2 override scenario, which is how we ultimately, you all and FinCom being part of it, arrived at the 8.46 number that you all voted on. And so this new scenario is very new for all of us. And we just want to make sure that we're putting in the same analysis into that number as we did with the 8.46 budget being part of what would have been a $10 million override for 3 years on the operating side. So that's, like Sam said, that's the task ahead of us. And the reason we're here is to get more clarity about how you see that playing out. Because again, that's a model that doesn't just include FY20, but also some 21 expectations and even year 22 expectations.
And so I would also say that thought Michelle and others with FinCom leadership did a good job last night as their committee began to talk about certain line items in our budget. The tech director came up for some conversation. It's sort of inevitable because we talk about budgets in terms of what it is we want to buy with it. Leadership, I think, did a good job reminding the committee FinCom's job is not to opine on specific line items in a budget, but to vote a bottom line number. But given where they are in the process, it's sort of human nature to begin to look at many of those things. And so there's certainly great interest in acting on the needs-based budget as soon as possible. Although we don't have it teed up for a vote today, we could certainly look for school committee consensus on some items that may get us closer. So this is a heads up to Judy, I'm going to pivot to you in a minute. But certainly in terms of process, there was an explicit request, since we do have a school committee meeting on March 5th, that's really our deadline to formally vote any reductions in the needs-based budget for FY20. And I want to thank Nicole particularly because so much information has been provided to your committee. I think there were some folks who were ready to vote a number last night, but Nicole kind of stepped in and said, but there's a process, and we just had February break, and the school committee hasn't met yet after the selectmen voted a lower number. So let's let that foot fall first so we don't trip over ourselves. So thank you for that. So this might be a good time,
Chris.
Judy? Brian.
Before you go to specifics,
Yeah.
can I ask a general
Yeah.
question?
Yep.
So originally there was going to be a 10 and 2 override, and that was anticipated to last 4 to 5 years.
3 to 5.
3.
3 to 5, 4 to 5.
3.
3.
So what is your understanding about the intent of an 8 and 2? Is the intent that it simply will last less long, that simply, we're going to do the same things that we would have done in a 10 and 2, but find ourselves having hit the ceiling in 2 years or 2.5 years? Or is the intent to still make that last 4 to 5 years? And I think it's really important when we look at our budget, what is the goal of an 8 and 2? If it's the last 2 years, it's not clear that you can't get there spending the exact same amount you were before and you run out faster. So I'm just trying to understand what you think, the select board thinks, what everybody's thinking, because no one said exactly. I was at the select board
Yeah,
meeting that wasn't clear.
So to me, so I can't speak for the select
Fair
board.
enough.
My perception during the select board discussion and the notes that I have and the text that I sent the chair of the finance committee who couldn't be there was 8 + 2 intended to last at least 2 years, longer if we can stretch it. But certainly not viewed to last as long as a 10 + 2 scenario. But let's do what we can to try to stretch it as far as possible. So to me, that implies, A, it's not going to last as long, but it also implies let's take another scrub through, especially in the out years, what's the spending that we're expecting and how do we prioritize to look at those budget needs. Obviously, there's a heavy focus on FY20 because of where we are in the process and upcoming Springtown meeting that needs to vote it. But we don't want to lose sight of the work that's been done, to Nicole's point, for FY21 and 22 to start at least looking out at that. And, to me, I think it's a positive where we've now opened the discussion around an override. The community's starting to understand what that means. And, I'd like to take maybe a month off after Springtown meeting. But then we need to continue the process and understand how long do we think our funds will last and start an active dialogue sooner than later so that whenever the time is for the next override, it's not a last-minute scramble. It's well understood. It's a discussion in the community about where the priorities are and how people want to spend funds and what that means. And it also gives us some time to work through, some tax relief programs for those folks who struggle to pay the increases.
Okay,
So to your question about, do we know if we have to actually change any of our plans
Yeah,
to meet
that-
this number?
that's
If it's for 2
ultimately-
years, I would say that there's a good likelihood that the model will show, and the model's just a model, it's not perfect, that yes, some changes might have to be made to not go beyond $8 million for FY21.
okay.
There's like 45, 46 iterations of the model now.
49 or 50.
And I don't know that any of them have the current town manager number
Not yet.
for the override scenario. So the 8% increase instead of 8.46% increase. So we need to see how much closer that gets us to 8 in year 2 of an override. I can't guarantee that it gets that it's below 8 yet. So
That'll be.
that's
crucial-
what
that's
our
crucial
process is
information.
going to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And I'm glad you asked that, Brian, because I heard, Michelle and I were talking about this the other day, I heard different things from different members of the select board. I think there's 1 or 2 members who think this should be enough to just provide for the same period. I heard very clearly from Mariano, for example, 8 is going to be 2 years. And so I'm not sure they're
United.
unanimous on that themselves. Yeah.
Can I also piggyback on that great question? Given that, I feel like we're being asked to put the cart before the horse. Why would we come off of these incredibly important needs at this point when we haven't even gotten to the point where the model is explaining exactly how long an 8 and 2 would last? We haven't heard from Lisa Wong. I feel like we need her input on her strategy for the next 2-3 years. And yet we're being asked once again to demote these priorities that we've given sufficient evidence on why they're still priorities. So I'm very, very, very hesitant to come off of. I mean, we've gone 3% almost down at this point. So it's very hard for me to understand how our squeezing our budget even further with the override will move the conversation any further along when there's just such a clear dichotomy of opinions. So I don't really know how us coming off of this is going to help the schools in the long run rather than some of the opinions against the override. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, so 2 parts, I would say. The first part is when your budget was put together, it was under the and please correct me if I'm wrong, it was under the assumption that we were asking for a $10 million override. That's how we arrived at the 8.46 number and some of the out year asks. All that was, while we don't vote your line items, you certainly did use line items to build up that number under that assumption of 10. That's not the case anymore. So this is your opportunity to talk about things. And we didn't call this meeting. So I think that's an opportunity for the school committee and for Superintendent Evans to talk about what that means, what this new scenario means for you, in a proactive way. So I think that this is a good thing. The other piece is that Lisa has given you a lower number because of this as well. So town manager's number in the override scenario is less than you are initially asking for. So regardless of FinCom's decision, at this point, that's something you might want to discuss. If we do end up just getting the town manager's number, what does that mean for us?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought we were talking about the 7.87, not the 8.46, so my apologies. Because you're asking us to consider the 8.46
Our
override
question,
budget,
Our
right?
question is, we have a solid understanding, FinCom, of what's in the 846. Now that that's
And
been
you voted
cut,
on that.
right? So
Okay.
now that that's been cut,
Okay.
how
To
do
about
you,
8%.
how do you see yourselves getting to what's in the town manager's budget book, right? And there's a couple options, right? So school committee, to your point, could say, heck no, we need 846. We're going to go to spring town meeting
ask for it,
and we're going to ask for 846,
I
even though
see.
the town manager asked for less.
And FinCom
And-
will
And then FinCom
Present a number
will
as well.
present what, what we think is an acceptable number. We tend to go lower than higher.
I'm well aware.
This is a preview. And what I do think has been great in all seriousness for the last several years as part of the budget advisory process that Judy has had with a couple school committee members and FinCom members, we haven't had to bring a debate to the town
Right,
meeting floor,
right.
right? There's been a lot of good discussion, number crunching, debate, pushback, and we end up bringing a consistent number to the town meeting floor to then vote. And so that's certainly my preference, but it's not a requirement. It can work any way you guys want to do it.
Okay.
I think what we're looking for from FinCom in an ideal scenario is, how do you propose to get to the town manager's number, assuming that you'll support that and vote for that? And is there anything more you think you can do as we try to stretch this funding as far as possible? That's really, to me, the question on the table.
Right, so I mean, next year, part of our role next year as a finance committee is going to be to look at, all right, well, we voted an $8 million override as a town, assuming that that's what ends up happening. How do we make it work for 2021? So depending on what happens in 2020, might make some of your tentative plans for 2021 less likely.
Right,
Or maybe, impossible from a finance committee perspective, and maybe we come to that point where we disagree next year. So I think it's better to just be proactive, and if we can do the analysis that we've been doing and that we provided you with to get to that 8.46 and the plans for the out years, we might as well just do the same thing now under this new scenario, so that we can all be as informed as possible and make, responsible choices that the whole town meeting can agree with.
Okay.
And can I just pick up on that point in terms of being as informed as possible? So Nicole's right, they didn't request this meeting. I actually asked them to be here to listen to our discussion so that they can keep their committee informed, given how the clock is running pretty late in this process. So there are really three sources of budgets for Springtown meeting, as far as we're concerned. There's a number we vote, there's the town manager's budget, and then there's the budget that FinCom actually proposes for a vote. As Sam just indicated, in many years, there's some agreement by the time we actually get to that motion. But that's not always the case. In some years, all three numbers have been the same. In some years, the manager has come in with the school committee, but FinCom has recommended lower. There have been some years where FinCom and the manager were together. School committee was higher. I would say 5 or 6 years ago, there was a motion from the floor of town meeting to amend the school committee budget, and it was amended, and we got more money for some instructional materials. And that was a debate, and of course, you have to identify the funding source. So it can be different, right, year over year, but at the end of the day, the number that we voted for needs-based drove the 10 million, contributed substantially to the $10 million figure. Once the select board voted 8, then if we were to dig in our heels and say we're not giving an inch, that means reductions across the board elsewhere.
I
right?
just want to clarify, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk about what we bring to town meeting. I remember that history. I thought we were trying to only tailor the model. So I didn't want to like go back, I misunderstood the what we were being asked to do. So I just want to clarify that.
But it is a topic of conversation, to your earlier point about why would we back off, right?
Right.
We've identified
Right,
all
right,
these
right,
critical
right, right.
needs. So a fundamental question is, are we then to do less with less over the same time frame? Or are our goals to accomplish the same goals, make the same investments, but because we have less money, it just doesn't stretch out as long? That is the fundamental question. And I think that's why a couple of members of FinCom even expressed last night some surprise even about where we are right now, even with some of the proposed reductions that Judy will speak about in a moment, given that that's a substantial drop from 10 to 8. Would we not see a corresponding drop in the school committee budget? I think if that's the direction we would go, that tends to support the idea of just doing less over the same time frame, right? So that's a conversation we've not had as a school committee, Zena, and that's why it was important to meet this morning to talk about that. So maybe this is a good time as any to segue to you, Judy.
Sure, happy to.
As you're being passed last-minute updates. You've got it all
Passing
figured
notes in
out.
class.
Ellen just gave you the answer.
You got the answer there.
We're done.
What's the question?
The great
Oh,
Carmen.
here we go. Karnak.
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 So the budget development process this year obviously has been quite challenging because the hard work done by the working group to start looking ahead beginning in the summer or late spring of last year in terms of what our long-term needs are. It gave us the opportunity to look at what we'd been asking for the last several years but had not been able to afford given the resources. And so our initial plan, where we had high hopes to have sufficient funding to address some long deferred requests or enrollment related ads, particularly at middle and high school, led to a first draft budget that had many needs addressed. And when it became clear that the resources wouldn't be able to accomplish that in 1 year, then we spread it out over a several-year plan. And so looking at what our budget would be if we were not able to have those resources led to the austerity budget, which is a pretty dire budget that will result in significant cuts to services and teachers and programs, and will also require us to have some hard discussions about fees, which we haven't had yet, around particularly the fees that we've built in as cuts for athletics and also cuts to transportation, and whether we want to just, and music lessons, whether we want to put the burden on parents to have doubling or tripling of their pretty substantial fees that they're paying now, or whether we want to eliminate programs. And also, I think we'll have to have some really hard discussions about if we cut 20% of our athletic budget and reduce by 100,000 our appropriated support for athletics, it will be important for the school committee to have some discussions about if we are supporting only the austerity budget, will we be accepting contributions from the community to make up for some of the lost services or programs? And I think that's an important thing that's going to require a lot of conversation, because as superintendent, I don't ever want to see students not being able to participate in athletics or co-curriculars or transportation to Mystic School. But on the other hand, I think it's important not to rely on donations from the community to make up things that we should be paying for through the appropriated budget. And it took many years for us to reduce our reliance on the Sports Foundation to support athletics. So when we are presenting really clear summaries of what will happen if we have an override passed and we have somewhere around 8% increase in our budget, what that will result in, I think we have to stay the course on those things. Likewise, on the austerity budget, we have to be really clear that if we are threatening to cut things, that those in fact will be the cuts and that they won't be replaced by some other source of funding that suddenly miraculously appears. I think sending the right message about what people are voting for an override is really important, and it would undermine our credibility if we suddenly found money somewhere that would, I think, result in suspicion that we were asking for too much in the first place and that we didn't really need it. And so all of those sort of philosophical, political frame decisions around an override, I think, are critically important for us to continue to focus on. The reality that we face is that the select board has voted that we'll have only $8 million. And we all know that that's not enough to meet the needs that we identified in the plan that was constructed over several months. And so we will have to make decisions about how much we pull back so that we stretch that out as long as possible. I don't think any of us want to be here a year from now looking for a second override because our expenses are greater than we expected. And so it's the responsibility of the school department and school committee and Ellen and I and the principals and the leadership team to take a very close look at every request, see what is absolutely essential, what is necessary, what is needed, and where we can possibly reduce our ask. And so when the town manager said that she was looking for about a $225,000 reduction based on what she perceives to be a reasonable revenue for the next year, Ellen and I went and sharpened our pencils again. Now, this is not an unusual thing. Every year we do this as part of our budget planning process. When you develop a budget in December for something that's happening 9 months later, you're going to encounter some surprises. Sometimes they're good surprises and sometimes they're bad surprises. And so sometimes it means that we have additional expenses, particularly related to unanticipated enrollment, out-of-district tuition, transportation, English language learners that require additional teachers that we didn't anticipate. Some of those are surprises that are that we have to flex around and find a way to meet. The state requires we're in school for 180 days a year. There are certain restrictions. So some districts in other states do things like, well, we'll go to 4 days a week and we'll cut our budget by 20%. Can't do that in Massachusetts. We have a requirement to be in session for. So we work within a certain restriction in terms of what the parameters are for budget development.
And we did this last year because we were on tenterhooks about what the special education circuit breaker was going to be.
Right,
And then
and we
worked
still-
around it. We didn't order some stuff, and then by the end of the year, everything did work out. So
We
this
had
is
to
normal.
We had to work really hard to meet our budget target at the end of last year. And as you remember, we had anticipated that we might have to tap into the Special Education Reserve Fund, which we fortunately did not have to do. We squeaked by. So there are sometimes unpleasant or unexpected surprises. Likewise, there are sometimes surprises or unanticipated savings that we did not anticipate, primarily personnel related. And so some of those come about as a result of unexpected retirements, and so that's always, we try to build in the right number when we do our initial budget, but then other folks surface and retire, and we're able to replace them at a significant cost savings, and that helps. So this is not unusual that Ellen and I would be able to identify some savings at this point based on the changes. Now it's nearly March from December when we initially presented this budget. So the recommended budget reductions are not, in fact, except in one instance, necessarily going to result in any reduced services or programs. And so that's why they're on this list. So I'll go through them one by one and just take questions as I go, and then we can get your response to this. There are a couple of things I think it's important that we keep in mind. There are still a few unknowns about our budget. We don't know what the Chapter 70 number is going to land on. In the end, we think it's probably not going to go down. Sometimes it has gone down a little bit, as it did last year, but in general, we think it's probably fairly solid, and we don't think it'll go up much. We don't know what the ultimate Chapter 70 reimbursement is going to be. We have forecast that pretty conservatively, and so we think we'll be okay, but circuit breaker. but we sometimes can be surprised. And we still have to look at 3 union contracts that have not yet been settled. And so there are a few still unknowns in terms of the budget development, but that's typical in any year. We often have unknowns going into even town meeting and beyond. There are a couple of things I just want to make sure that everyone understands are additional sources of revenue that we had talked about at last town meeting that I'm not sure that anyone on the town side has taken into consideration, and that is we're currently educating an out-of-district student in one of our in-district special education programs. That tuition is going straight into free cash, goes right to the town. Right now, that's a $45,000 tuition. If we had available spaces in our in-district programs, we could add other students. That could be an additional source of revenue to offset expenses. So there is that $45,000 by the end of the year that will be flowing back into the town's revenues.
Is
So
it factored into Lisa's?
it's not factored into any budget that I know of.
Okay.
So, all right, so let's go through the draft budget reductions, and I just want to also reiterate that in any conversations with finance committee or the town manager or any individual school committee members, I have tried to be careful to say that budget approval is one of the responsibilities of school committee, and that you have not discussed this. These are just some identified areas of savings. So the first is elementary enrollment. I did send you recently the mid-February district enrollment, and as you can see from our pattern, we're fairly close in, if you move all of the existing students up a year, K to 5, we're fairly close to what our projections are for next year. So I feel confident and comfortable that the $60,000 that we had set aside for an enrollment-related position, it will not be necessary. The only surprise could be if the kindergarten numbers required us to add 1 or 2 teachers there that we did not anticipate. Right now, we're carrying 337 names of kindergartners we think should be coming to us on our list, and I don't know how many of those will enroll.
And that's based on the census?
That's based on the census of names we have, 337 right now. So right now, I think we could have, we're carrying 110 elementary sections, and so I'm comfortable reducing 1 section. And it could be that if the stars align, that we could reduce another section. And I'm waiting till after kindergarten registration to make that known.
And that would be after town meeting.
And that
Right.
would be
Sorry, that would be after the vote.
after the override
After
vote.
the override, sorry,
Right, but there's
yeah.
a potential for another section saving there. We have a few hot spots you might remember, particularly at Lincoln, but we're out of space at Lincoln. So a couple of average class sizes around 22 or slightly over. We have 1 of 23 at Morocco at this point. So depending on how enrollment works out as the year progresses, we'll have to go back and revisit this. We have a couple of small class sizes as well. Got a VO, we've got 64 students in first grade, for example, projected for next year with 4 sections. That's a fairly low class size of 16, but too many really for first grade. 3 sections, so that's the battle I always have. I meet with each of the principals. How's it looking? Do we need to add? Do we? The request is never to deduct, but so it's a little bit in flux till after kindergarten registration finishes, and we'll see where we are. But I feel very confident at this point that we can reduce the 60 without any impact. Ellen, anything you want to add?
The 110 is based upon it being reduced by 1.
Yeah.
Where
So
is
it wouldn't
this?
go to
But total.
109.
Yeah, it would be.
Oh, we could go to 109 if the stars align here at 1 or more schools. But so again, kindergarten projections. We currently have 5 kindergartens at Lynch for next year, and we'll see. That could be 4, depending on the enrollment. So
Judy, the way the timing works with kindergarten registration, am I right in thinking we wouldn't really have a sense of 109 versus 110 until mid-April?
So
Is that
we've
about right?
we've been nudging and nudging the names we have. Unfortunately, we only have addresses, so we send letters and try to nudge folks along. We've asked everyone to enroll by March 1st, but we've only got about 40 or 50 students enrolled at this point. We get a big influx after the parent-to-parent meeting we have for kindergarten, which is in March. A lot of parents come and they just want to be sure that kindergarten's right for them, and they ask questions. The nurses are there, a nurse is there, principal is there. It's a good event. So I would suspect right after the override, by the beginning of April, we'll have a good sense for what our trends are. And there are a couple of other grade levels that I'm watching closely to see whether I need 3 sections or 4 sections. So
So the section comment that you just made, the 1 or 2, is that reflected on this page, the 7.87?
yes, that's taken out.
Yes.
So in your
I'm
in your
looking at the wrong
packet you
page.
have
Okay.
Based on 110.
Thank you.
that's based on
Oh,
This is based on 110.
it's based on 110. Got it.
I'm sorry, what is based on 110?
The budget that follows.
But 110 was also what was
Yeah.
in the original budget.
So we had, go ahead.
The 8.46
Yeah.
had 111.
I had 111.
Even though we were anticipating 110 as of that.
It was a little under the hood.
Okay.
apparently.
So what we were trying to do was be sure that we asked for the appropriate number of enrollment-related positions, but I think I said from the outset, we may or may not need this. But certainly
You did say that.
certainly the positions that we're asking for at middle and high school are all, I would put them in the category of dire needs. That there's no chance that any of those will be pulled back. Okay, any other questions on the elementary enrollment? So the second reduction is the high school special education teacher. We had one special education teacher that we were going to share between our Learning Center 3 and Learning Center 4 students at the high school. It's strictly based on individual education plans, IEPs, and ratios, and we just have many more students in those 2 programs. One is a program for students with cognitive impairment and life skill. One is for students who have more social emotional issues. We needed a teacher between the 2. It looks like as we review our projected staffing needs for special education at elementary, middle, and high school, what we do every year is look at every one of our 800 or 900 students who need special services and what their services will be 1 year from now, and whether or not we will need additional staffing. And sometimes based on our specialized programs or the number of students who have certain categories of disability, we can shift staff or reduce staff or add staff as needed. And so as part of the review of this, it looks like we'll be able to shift a staff member from another special education position in the district from a program that is projected to have a reduction in numbers next year. And so I'm suggesting that we take that $70,000 off of the budget ask and use and rely on a transfer. We didn't know 4 months ago whether we'd be able to do this, but because we've been reviewing IEPs and looking at staffing needs very closely, both for teachers and teaching assistants for special education, we're confident that this additional add will not be required. Any questions on that?
So the risk is that we do need this, and we have to find $70,000 in the budget mid-year, not mid-year, September.
So I think we would know, we'd certainly know by April or May, because we will have teachers assigned or reassigned by that point. Jen has been really working closely with Pam around particularly co-teaching needs and teaching assistant needs for next year. Jen, I don't know if you want to speak to the process or the risk of taking this off at this point and relying on a transfer.
Yeah, I mean, I think based on we always joke, right, special ed is a little bit like Jell-O. It's not totally firm.
Jen, could
so
you grab a mic?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Oh, here.
Thanks. So I think based on where we are in looking at kind of the whole picture, and obviously Pam spends a lot of time with this, this is probably our safest bet for where our numbers sit right now. And like Judy said, coming and goings, we learn a lot more over the next 2 months, so that'll be a little bit clearer as we go. So
We would potentially know we would know more before town meeting.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Yep. And it's a lot like EL, special ed, all those things. That's the place where it could,
Exactly.
something unanticipated can come up. But this is clearly the place where we feel pretty comfortable with this at this point.
And the program that we're taking the teacher from and the program we're taking the teacher to, do we know if the IEPs have been reviewed for the year for the kids in those programs, so we know the changes aren't going to happen?
So, as you know, with the IEPs, they happen whenever their annual comes
Right.
up. So based on where we are currently, that's correct.
Okay.
So, and this is something, regardless of whether we were facing an override or whatever the resources are, that we would be looking at every year.
Right.
We won't spend the money if we don't need to.
Right.
Right, and so we want to staff appropriately and not overstaff, and so this is where, so the next category is reading specialists. And I think that this is one that you may have more questions about. And I'm going to ask Jen to weigh in on this as well, and give her recommendation. So the district has quite a large number of reading specialists, and the model for reading support has been a building-based model where reading specialists, who are primarily former elementary classroom teachers, have provided in the past direct services to students. It used to be more pull-out services, and now it's mainly push-in services where they go into classrooms and work with groups of students. Generally, in the lower grade levels, it used to be all the way up through 5th. At the elementary level, I think the focus now is more on early literacy. You might recall that a couple of years ago, we added a literacy coordinator, Katie Malone, who's been working closely with reading specialists and elementary teachers to try to shift the focus from intervention or reading support to more proactive improvement of primary reading instruction. WIFI and INCA and some other groups have really supported this through professional development and attendance at the Columbia Teachers College on the Lucy Calkins program, and reading and writing workshop. And so the model for reading instruction has shifted somewhat in the district. And really what we have seen, and our standardized test scores support this in terms of overall achievement levels, that our students' ability to read at or above grade level is heavily dependent on how strong the primary instruction is. And then the intervention piece is secondary. And the push-in model, I think, works really well in many ways, but in some ways it's done during the literacy block and not as an extra intervention. And so that's something that we've really wrestled with. Our primary restriction in providing reading support is twofold. One is we really need reading literacy coaches who can work directly with teachers to help them use Readers and Writers Workshop more effectively and to meet the needs of the students who might be struggling, or students who are advanced and need an extra bit of support to continue their progress. The other piece is that the building-based model doesn't give us any flexibility. We test all of the students in the elementary schools at the beginning of the year. And the reading specialists provide support for the students who are identified as needing support. But unlike the English learner model, where Jen has pulled that as a district team and reallocates as needed, we haven't reallocated reading specialist support. So some schools have landed with more support than others, and the support has not been used in a flexible way. And so I think that we have an opportunity now to shift the model and increase efficiency. There are some drawbacks to not having folks be strictly building-based. They build relationships, they know the teachers and the students well, but there's a lot more flexibility to reallocate resources if this is a district-based team. I also think that our reading specialists do a really good job. They're highly skilled, valued employees, and they work really hard. Some districts use a tutor model that is much less expensive, where they hire teaching assistants or others to provide reading support. Our model is a very expensive model, and that's something that, given our per pupil spending and our resources, it may not be affordable or the most efficient model. And so as we look to adjust this model, we have an opportunity this year. We have 2 highly valued, very experienced reading specialists retiring. And I am reluctant to fill those positions as we're kind of transitioning the model. And it allows us to see about $166,000 savings on our overall budget. And so, Jen, I don't know if you want to weigh in if there's anything I didn't say or something you want to emphasize that I did say. But I think this gives us an opportunity to reevaluate the model without laying anybody off, because this is an attrition decision, and provide a transition to a more flexible support model. So, Jen, you want to?
Sure. Just a couple of things I'd love to emphasize. So we've morphed a little bit with these reading literacy coaches over the past couple of years, and they've been outstanding. That has been extremely helpful to our work. The teachers are giving us great feedback about how, because even when you have a reading teacher doing, so like Judy said, we primarily focus on a lot of ERSP. To try to do that early reading support. Obviously, K to 3 are huge years. So we try to do a lot of services during that time. But it's really helpful to our teachers that are with them all day long, because we try to emphasize constantly, and our teachers are great about reading doesn't just happen in reading, neither does writing. And reading, writing, and thinking are all connected. So when you can do that with social studies and with science and with math and places where students feel excited sometimes about the content rather than thinking about reading as a skill of decoding, moving instead to, the whole picture of reading. So the literacy coaches have been great about helping our classroom teachers with that piece. So that's been huge. And the other thing that's been really helpful is we've moved and we've piloted a little bit of co-teaching with reading. So we're doing that now, not only, as you know, we started with special ed and gen ed as our co-teaching teams, but we have some co-teaching going on with reading and some co-teaching going on with EL in our schools where we have some bigger populations in a certain grade. And so we're really using that model. I think it's been very helpful to the students and to the staff to do that whole, what we've always talked about, the services should follow the students, and clustering students and then allowing the services to follow them. So I think working more and evolving that around reading will be a huge piece of what we're trying to do. And, as Judy said, nobody wants to cut anything. But rather than thinking about class sizes going large, trying to think about how we reallocate due to natural attrition anyway, seems like a sensible budget decision, as well as a way that we can continue to evolve our services to the students.
And just to reiterate, the literacy coaches are reading specialists who are building-based
Part-time.
people, part-time, providing
Literacy
more
coaching.
coaching of classroom teachers as opposed to just direct service to students. So these aren't extra positions that we've added.
It's a reallocation of
It's a
part of their
reallocation.
job description.
Yeah. So I'm sure a lot of questions about
Can I
this.
just ask a clarification question? And when you say they're part-time, if these 2.0 FTEs were not filled and then we're relying more heavily on literacy coaches, then would we not need some additional literacy coach time?
So that's a great question. I guess it's the definition of need. So in my world, we would have a lot more, as in your worlds, based on what we think we need for our services. But no, I don't. I think we can service. It will just have to look different. How we service based on what we have.
So let me reframe the question if I can real quick, Susan. So Judy was saying earlier, the first two aren't really reductions in services, the 60 and the 70. And therefore, by process of elimination, I'm thinking this one is.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So all things being equal, you cut 2 FTEs,
Yep.
that's a reduction in service.
Correct.
Would we not need some increase in hours of literacy coaches so that this would not be net a reduction in services?
No, not necessarily. I mean, we would just have to decide, once we have our spring data with the students, we would have to allocate what do we need for direct services with students, and then that would lessen, most likely that would lessen our literacy coaching time, and we would just
Okay.
lose that.
All right, thank you. Susan, go ahead.
Actually, Mike, was a clarifying question I had, which I think you almost just answered, which is in the spring. Judy said we test all the students in the spring, and by test you mean sort of as a diagnostic kind of where they're at kind of thing.
So we do a couple of things. So we use the nationally F&P, Fontes and Pinnell.
Yep.
So we use that certainly as part of it, but we ask our teachers to look beyond that. So we have a whole rating system also about what they see in practice in the classroom. And certainly we also look at, MCAS scores. We look at other practices that they're doing in other assessments. And then we determine how many students we think need direct services based on that kind of whole picture. So we do that in the spring to think about what the scheduling will be like for the fall.
So that's more individualized and differentiated instruction rather than a kind of.
It also helps inform us about clustering for classroom when we do
Yeah.
classroom placement. And that way we say, okay, instead of, the model like it was 5 years ago was, every reading teacher went to a classroom for half an hour. And so, right, so now what we try to say is, okay, let's place these students, let's cluster these, and now we can send a reading teacher for 2 hours into this classroom. This classroom is a co-teach with a special ed teacher. This gets EL services. So again, allowing the services to follow students.
So we have not had a district reading team in the past, like the EL teachers. It's been, folks have been assigned to a school and stayed there forever, essentially. And so the reallocation will allow us to better meet student needs.
And just to be clear, a lot will still be building based. It's not, even with our EL staff, people very often stay in the same building. It won't necessarily mean a lot of movement. It just means some years this building may need 2 reading specialists, and some years a different building may need the 2 reading specialists.
Chris, can I ask
Yeah, go
a
ahead.
quick question? Forgive my ignorance, but does that at all impact Lynch's Title I?
So certainly there will be a certain amount that goes to Lynch and stays there as Title I, because we do pay reading teacher salaries out of Title I
Okay,
at Lynch. Yeah,
thank you.
they have the most reading support now that exceeds what we get in our Title I funds.
Got it.
So you can't supplant grant-funded positions. You can't sort of
Right.
Eliminate them.
eliminate that, right? So, other questions about the?
But you can choose how to allocate those resources once they come
Correct.
to you and how you utilize them. And this sounds like it's not so much a reduction in services, but a programmatic change.
I think it's a shift in how we're approaching support for reading, and a movement from just supporting students to supporting teachers as well that's been happening gradually, and a recognition that we can increase efficiency.
Right.
It is a reduction in the number of bodies that we have to teach reading. But I wouldn't make the recommendation if I didn't think that we were able to accommodate it. And so, so this is my recommendation.
Does this take into account the new changes in the dyslexia screening law from
Say that again, Michelle?
Dyslexia.
Yes. Does this take into account the
So we've had lots of
changes?
conversations about that.
Okay. I know it's still amorphous.
Right. So the piece of the reading support puzzle that we haven't talked about is we provide lots of support for students who struggle with reading through special education. So once it's the extent of a disability, that falls under special education.
Okay.
We're if we have a shortfall in any area of reading support, it's the number of teachers who are certified and trained in a variety of reading intervention strategies that are used for students with diagnosed disabilities, like Gordon Gillingham or Linda Bell, or there are probably others that, Wilson, for example. And so once students have a structured reading program, they really are taught reading by a special education teacher instead of a reading specialist. Am I right in saying the reading specialists work with all students, but primarily regular education students?
Correct.
And are we still working on having a variety of programs for language-based learning disorders instead of like Wilson for everyone?
Yeah. So I think we've been very successful at elementary and middle school level with our language-based learning disabled students who need
Yeah.
more structured reading programs. Jen, I don't know if you have any.
I think that's true for our LBLD program. Like that program has really grown and all the way actually up through the high school now. So that's been great. No, I think that's still an area to grow. That's more under the, like Judy said, the reading teachers are typically mostly gen ed.
Yep.
And that's more of a special ed piece. I think as a district, we still, everybody knows I'm not too
room to
shy
go.
about saying we still turn to Wilson predominantly, and that's an area we can grow, is expanding the type. Because Wilson is outstanding for a certain type of learner that it responds well to that support.
Right.
It's not the only game in town, so that's still an area to grow. Another PD activity.
Yeah.
Get ready.
Brian, you had a
Can I ask
question?
Philosophical question. It feels like this is, it feels like it's a budgetary driver forcing a programmatic change as opposed to what we would prefer, which is a programmatic change than saying how we want to change our budget, because this clearly wasn't in our budget
Yep.
2 months ago. So this change, it feels like it's being pushed for budgetary reasons. Is that, if we could go back 2 months ago, would you have taken this out back 2 months ago then too, because this is the way you'd like to see the program go?
That's such a complicated question.
Complicated.
So what I would say to you is, I think I've been pretty open that I think we have a very expensive staffing model for reading support that may not best meet the needs of our students. And often in schools, when people retire, we just replace them because they're providing good services and are valued members of the community. And Jen and I have been talking about a shift for several years in the reading support model to have a more reallocation of resources, and that we don't just stay with the same number of reading specialists that we've had at each school. It's been a transition that would happen whether or not we had budget pressures. I think this is an opportunity for us to take a step back and not fill these positions and help meet our budget targets, but at the same time, I'm not going to say, I'm never going to come back to you and say we don't need more funding the following year for reading support. I suspect it would look different than hiring reading specialists. And as you know, as Jen said, the move to a coaching model has proven to be highly successful. Teachers who are with students for 6 hours a day, teaching them to read, write, speak, and listen, can benefit from additional strategies and coaching and professional development, and another set of hands in the room to really help the students progress. Sending someone in for half an hour is not going to really help students. And so I think taking advantage of this opportunity to take a step back and see how a reallocation of resources based on the spring tests will allow us to shift the direction a bit. So it's a combination. I think I am always reluctant to offer up positions and resources unless we have a direct pressure to do so, and in this case, it seems like rather than laying people off, if this were a layoff, I wouldn't be coming to you because these are highly valued employees, but because it's a retirement, it makes it an easier decision, and it helps meet our budget targets at the same time.
Susan?
I have kind of a dim recollection that years ago, since you mentioned Title I, Morocco was also a Title I school and also got funding for a reading teacher through Title I. So I'm wondering if years ago there were these positions, then it was, well, certain schools have more reading teachers than others. We should have equality of reading specialists in each building, and that has become sort of just like the institutional kind of inertia that, you know, this is just how we budget, and we just keep these positions.
Right. I think you're
and
right
it
about that.
Sounds like there's been some evolution in the thinking around how to best teach reading to young students, and that you're trying to move the district forward and you know, follow this evolution rather than stick with, you know, just what we've always had, where the, you know, the building-based person is the person who just is there half an hour every day in each class.
Well, we're trying to model also walking the talk, even though sometimes that's hard. We talk with teachers all the time about fair is not equal in the classroom, and that, everybody doesn't get a pair of glasses. If you don't need glasses, you don't get glasses. And the way we've done some of these positions in the past in the district is 3, 3, 3, 3, and then Lynch, Title I, 4 point something. And now we're saying, the different schools may get different amounts, just like what happens with EL. So there's certainly, more students in some schools that need EL services than in other schools. And that's what follows there. And that's a model we'd like to talk about in all of our areas, instead of always thinking fair is equal and every school should have the same amount. Some schools may need more in one department and less in a different department. And asking teachers to do that also means we need to ask ourselves to do that, so.
So can I offer, maybe to pick up on Susan's point, I don't remember the Morocco Title I piece, but you were there as a parent before me. I do remember in my first year on the school committee, there was some data that told us that we were struggling with our sixth grader reading comprehension at McCall. Not that that's a specific MCAS test, but there was something interpreted from ELA at the sixth grade level. And there was some focused discussion at the school committee table about needing to make some investments in our elementary students to try to address that. I remember that was a discussion that was brought forward by Mark Kerbel. We did make some investments, so I don't know if it was more about just saying everybody should be equal. I think there was a concerted effort to say we're slipping somehow. Forgive me, I can't remember what the sources were of that information, but I remember it was a lengthy conversation. I have a couple of thoughts I want to share. I appreciate Brian's observation that it feels like this is a budgetary driver that may be forcing a programmatic change, and it's nothing we talked about in January. I also want to acknowledge Judy has talked before about the relative expense of how we address reading today. But what concerns me is, having said that, if we're going to make a change, I'd like to know where it's going. I'd like to know what the plan is. So a year from now, so for FY21, if there's a retirement, or if there are 2 retirements, then what are we expecting of those reading specialists who remain? And so how are we spreading them? Are they effective? I'd like to have a better sense of what the plan is before we cut. And I think for me, a trigger word, Judy, is when you say, I think we can be more efficient. On the one hand, I want to buy into that on this particular granular discussion, but as a committee, we've all acknowledged that when we look at our budget, our whole budget over time, and we look at our per pupil spending, one of the things we've said is that for years, this was a town that looked at how efficient we were being as though that was a good thing, and our per pupil spending was getting sort of lower and lower relative to our peers. So I'm struggling knowing that we just got a motion for 8 instead of 10, that we have a town manager's proposal which is less, and we need to get there, that cutting these 2 FTEs, in fact, goes beyond Lisa's number. So what Judy has shared with us is, and this is probably where you were getting, is we sort of have this net reduction that even goes beyond Lisa's number by $70,000. So I wonder if, here's how I think about this is, so we have 2 retirements, and they're going to happen. And you've talked about how you think you can accommodate the needs of students. I hope that we're in a position where we don't need to add more time for our literacy coaches, but maybe we will, because I think I heard we'll do more assessments. I mean, there may be a need for some additional cost. I'd be more comfortable taking Lisa's number, knowing that rather than going all the way with the $296 or almost $300,000 in reductions, knowing that there's some money there for some supplemental resources for reading, which we may need once we assess students, is something I think I'm more comfortable with, for what it's worth. But then I think we should have the conversation.
Yeah.
To my bigger point is, if the model we have, if there's a better way to do it, not just in terms of cost, but student outcomes, I think that should be a conversation with the school committee, and that we kind of have a multi-year plan on how we get there. Dina?
You can go first. I
was going to say that that's a good point, and that we are going beyond the needed reduction. However, I think we're getting a little bit down into the weeds of making decisions about how you educate students.
Yep.
And what the better models are. And that's Judy and Jen's and the educators' realm, not ours. So if we're looking to do a little horse trading, it just seems if there's a risk on kindergarten enrollments, we keep the elementary teacher slot rather than get into how to fund reading and how to carry out reading instruction.
Or we just keep one enrollment related FTE
Right, one
and use it where
yeah.
where Judy and Jen and the staff would think it was most
And-
needed.
Right, and we have added coaches without having an override to pay for them. You know,
Fair-
we would
fair-
like to have
yeah.
the ability to design our program and listen to the recommendations of our superintendents and
Right.
professionals without people sort of getting into, you know, if you lose money for reading, you know, then if you're adding something, you'll have to go back for an override to get another
Right.
you know,
Right.
reading specialist.
My point simply was going to be that if we were to accept this recommendation, it doesn't mean we've had a conversation about changing the way in which we're teaching our kids how to read. That's my point. We've had those kinds of conversations in the past.
So I would like to second and emphasize what Susan's saying. What we've heard today is not that the budget is driving a programmatic change. It's that here we are with an opportunity to make what the educators in the room are telling us are what's best for our kids. And I think they get to make that judgment call on programs, and we support it. Like, I don't think we should get into that nitty gritty. Additionally, why I think that the approach Judy is taking with going a little bit below what the town manager proposed goes back to FinCom, what FinCom is asking us to do here. So forgive my math, but you'll have to obviously ignore that part. But from what I see with the $45,000 tuition and the possible second elementary enrollment, we are closer from the 7.87 number, closer to the 6.768 number that is reflective of an 10 million gone down to 8 million. It's kind of the proportional.
Like a 20%
Right,
reduction.
it's a 20% difference, so it gets us, it shows that we are working better towards that modeling request, which then extends the override potentially another year. So I don't want us to just go with the town manager's number. If we can extend the override, because that helps our taxpayers, and it sounds like our schools can handle some of this movement with the retirements. So if I'm correct in my math, then
So just a couple thoughts, and Ellen can weigh in on the sort of the overall impact. Reading support takes a disproportionate amount of our budget. It's close to $3 million, I think, of our overall budget is for reading specialists. And so when I say it's an expensive model, it's a choice that we've made that has served our students well. Our elementary MCAS scores, if you want to use that measure, are among the highest in the state for all 5 schools on both ELA and math. They're very, very strong. Our students' achievement levels are very high. I am confident that the reading specialists have contributed to that. But when you have insufficient resources, you have to really look at, are there efficiencies in a shift of a model that will result in better services to students and kids and a similar level of achievement? And that's the educational decision that we've been wrestling with for many years around reading support and shifting the model. So I appreciate the support on that, and I think it is important for us to come back and do a report for you. You did support the literacy coordinator position. She's added a lot of value. She needs to come in. I think she and Jen and I will present to you about, here are the assessments we use, here are the trends that we're seeing, here are the additional pieces, especially in professional development, that we need to, and program, and guided, and leveled readers, and the whole shebang.
If-
Go ahead.
I just want to jump in really quickly and say that with that approach of giving you, the educators, that flexibility, we're allowing you flexibility to update models as they're updated, because the same reading methods used 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago have changed probably dramatically. So we need to make sure to stay out of those weeds to give you that flexibility if.
Right, and I think when I ask for resources, or suggest reductions and asks, that you've got to be confident that we're making good decisions as a school committee. So what I would say to you is, that I would echo what I'm hearing from school committee members, that the current budget reductions that I have suggested bring us to a 7.87%, not including the additional revenue coming in on the 45. I think that's more aligned with what an $8 million override ask will provide. I'm very reluctant to increase our base budget by having personnel asks. And so the reduction, as you've seen it, those are all personnel positions, and then that will keep our base budget lower rather than trying to take a one-time kind of cut in something. To be very direct about it, there's not much I can cut on the expense side. We're asking for very little. There's not much I can ask. There is some room in contracted services and special education. Some of the positions that that are included in the override budget, like the BCBA position. We are currently filling some of that need through contracted services, which are much more expensive than hiring our own teacher and doesn't make the person available in the district. And so I'm hopeful that some of the personnel asks that we've been very purposeful about and the year and the year after will help us reduce on the contracted services end. Similarly, we'd love to hire our own people to do home-based services instead of hiring an outside agency through the collaborative to do that. So we will continue to look at efficiencies. What I would say to you is, based on the numbers that I have now for the elementary enrollment, I'm confident we won't need that additional enrollment-related position. And I would not advocate putting it in. Similarly, I'm confident that we can reallocate the special education position. The reading position is really a philosophical question. What I would say is, not including it in the budget this year doesn't mean we won't ask for some reading support in future years, but I'm confident in Jen that she has a plan to reallocate resources and provide good supports for our students and teachers in the area of reading if we were to make these reductions. And I think it does show a good faith effort to try to dig deep and look for efficiencies, look for potential reductions. I didn't know we would have 2 reading specialists retiring at the time I developed this budget. So at least one came in fairly recently. I don't know when the other came in. We might have known about one.
Right, we did know about one during the initial budget development, and when we got the other one, it helped bring about a bigger conversation.
So I think school committee members are in a hard spot because it's your job and my job to advocate for as much as we possibly can have for our students in terms of resources. But I think we've got to do what's reasonable and set ourselves up for success should the override be successful as well.
And I want to be very clear, Zena, FinCom hasn't asked us to cut a number below Lisa's budget. This was
We would love it.
But I want to make the point that Lisa has, as she's expected to do, she's presented a balanced budget.
Well,
She has a number.
Let me clarify what I meant then.
Okay.
I must have misspoke, because what I meant was, you guys were, somebody on FinCom had said, well, we went from 10 to 8, and yet they've only gone, or they're still at 8.46. So if you do like a proportional measured from 10 to 8, it turns out to be closer to 6.768.
So that was
So-
a sentiment expressed at the
Yes.
Finance
So I'm
Committee
saying
meeting.
that
And
we're showing good
in my
faith.
comments, I did say, as we look to stretch it,
Yeah.
you need to, ideally, you would at least get to the town manager's number, if not lower.
That's
So
what I did. So I'm just saying.
I think
we're-
that's what Zena's
we're
responding
doing
to.
good faith.
Yeah.
That goes
Work.
back to the philosophical question of whether
Exactly.
this
Right.
is
2-year.
a 2-year
A
or
2-year,
not. If
right.
it's a,
Right.
if it's a 2-year, and I don't know what your model says,
Model
it's
says
con-
2 years.
No. It's conceivable that we can spend the same amount that we had planned on spending in a 10 million and 10 and 2,
Right.
and it lasts less long than an 8 and 2.
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to say, well, if it's 20% less, all the budgets need to be cut by 20%, because if that's the case, all the needs-based asks need to be cut by 20%, because that by definition says we're saying it's a 4 to 5 year override.
Right.
Which is what they're trying to get to.
Is it a 4?
No,
I mean, I
they
guess
haven't
3 to
decided
5.
that
If it's
yet.
a 2 to 3 versus 3 to 5, no, I think it's important though, because if we're gonna say we're gonna cut by 20%, if a goal is to cut our ask by 20%,
Yep.
and if that's gonna be asked of everybody, then we're saying it's a 3 to 5 year. And so I think it just needs some clarity on that as far as what town.
So I would
town
park
leaders are
that.
asking.
I would park that and say, as I listen to Dr. Evans, these are certainly your elementary enrollment and your special ed shift are two cuts that I think are very comfortable, that can be absorbed and taken off the table. And then what I'm hearing on the reading specialist discussion is, we think this is an opportunity to reapproach it. And I'm sitting here and making myself a note of, okay, they may come back in FY21 and say, hey, guess what? We've changed our model, but we need one more reading resource to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, remember that conversation in FY20
Right.
when we took those two out? Well, we can get by without one, but we need the other, right?
Need the other.
Those are the conversations that we have, which is why it's nice to have some continuity of resources across the table. I don't hear anything in this 296, I think that it adds up to, that is going to inflict significant pain on our educational process.
Or take
So-
out from the program developments that you had been anticipating as part of the override,
Correct.
right? Is that?
You know, we're talking about adding a multi-year program improvement of Mandarin
Right.
in the out years. I mean, as we add grades to that, we need room to do that.
And we're still looking at a significant amount of incremental funding for our schools if an override passes, right? Like, I appreciate that this is, almost $300,000 less, but
Still,
there's
Could
still.
still be a lot
Sam,
less.
Let's
and
not
Nicole-
lose sight, right, let's not lose sight of this big nut of opportunity if an override
So
passes.
Sam and Nicole, do I have it right that if, short of a vote today, if there's consensus at this table on a reduction on the school side for FY20, that you can plug that into your multi-year model for 20?
Yes.
You still have to take all of Lisa's recommendations in her book, based on the 8, plug
Yes.
it into the model, and given that we're sort of the 600-pound gorilla on spending, right? If we can give you a number on FY20, that once you plug that into the model, you'll have a better sense of what resources are there
Yes.
for the 21 and 22 initiatives
We would
that we have
assume those
discussed.
constant from
Yeah.
what Dr. Evans has presented.
Yeah. So in other words, there's still a process here because we have to sort of fill in this blank to the
Right.
extent we can. And then whatever feedback we get from FinCom is very helpful because I'm reluctant to say to the community what this override will mean for what we can do in 21 and 22.
Right.
Unless somebody has crunched the numbers.
Exactly.
Right.
And so they're sort of
Yes.
saying to us, okay, we got 8, not 10, so what do you think about 20? FY20, not $20 million. So that's where we are, right? So there's sort of an equation here, we're still plugging in some numbers. Does that
I
make, does
appreciate
that
that.
seem fair, Brian, the way to frame it that way?
I think so.
I mean, we do need to get to what year 2 and year 3 look like, but I think we need to come to some resolution or consensus on
At least
FY20.
year 2. If it's
I mean, I think the
Yeah.
model right
Right.
now.
No doubt,
Right.
no doubt.
The model right now shows us being very close to an $8 million number in 21.
Okay.
Right? It's more on the margin, like,
Right, meaning
are we a little bit,
two-year
are we
override.
a few $100,000 over or under?
Yeah.
So that's why we need to put in the stuff just so we don't overshoot, and then put ourselves in a bind the second year into an override.
Right.
But with all the groups keeping on the table what they want for FY20, and by all the groups I mean the other town departments. And for 21, any 21 ads, this is definitely a 2-year override. I think if we needed to get this to 3, something significant would need to change, either in the additions or something unexpected on the modeling side, where enrollment changes significantly downward, or there's some other departments have a reduction in needs
Or
that we
increased
didn't
revenue.
anticipate.
From the state. or
But if we do,
Yeah.
Like that, or a revenue
Or-
change that we
Chapter
didn't
70 goes
anticipate
up.
that's in a positive direction.
Or massive healthcare cost savings.
Right.
That we're not
Those are the
currently
only things that
anticipating.
I can see this making it to 3 years,
Yeah.
based on the model.
so, and just to clarify, when you say it lasts 2 years, all the staffing we've added, all the program improvements we've done are going to be at the same risk 2 years from now
Sure.
If an
if an override doesn't pass 2 years from now.
Right.
This
Now-
is for FY22.
right. I don't know what we'd have to look at our free
We
cash
could be going back to an
position,
austerity
and might
budget
have
in
a-
FY22.
We might have a buffer year, sort of like we did last year, where we
Yeah.
use more free cash than
Yep.
Right.
FinCom is usually comfortable with, to sort of delay an override.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not gonna look into the future. I'm just saying in terms of having a balanced budget, not having to pump in a lot of free cash, it certainly feels like 2 years is what everyone should be anticipating.
Yeah.
Okay.
The override increases the tax base, that then you go back and you can do 2.5% on.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's still more money.
Yes.
The
Right, but you
override
pay your
changes-
teachers
Con-
often more than
the-
2.5% each
Right,
year,
well,
so just
the
the
only
salaries.
other,
Yeah.
the only factor that changes is the increase, the
The override,
expense increase.
the override raises the tax levy limit. It's
Right.
the, it's the budgeting that then drives the taxation
Right.
follows the budgeting, so we have the
Right,
balanced
so I
budget.
mean, it's not like, oh, now you have to get rid of your tech director, it's just that, here's this number, here's what your expenses are, it's not like a necessarily, this position
Right.
is at risk.
Oh, no,
So
you would
it's-
still get your,
Right, yeah.
your budget, let's say in year 2022, we don't have an override, we can't use enough free cash to get everybody everything they need, so cuts have to happen. Every department is gonna decide with
Where the
the
cuts
town
come
manager and with FinCom,
Right.
you know, where those cuts are gonna come. Obviously, you know, school committee
And
has
that's a
more
risk,
leeway there.
budgeting risk that we do every year.
Every year.
So it's like,
For me, the
Yes.
school budget, it's actually, I realize it's not that simple, but it's fairly simple, right? It's all about staffing, which is driven by how many kids are here to be taught. It's about special education mandates and out-of-district placements. It's about transportation, both in-district and out-of-district. And I always had a fourth and I forget it. But even if you just look at those, oh, and healthcare costs.
And healthcare.
Right? And so if our contracts are growing at more than 2.5%, if our enrollment is growing and requiring additional staffing beyond a 2.5% cost, right? Which, if your salary increases are going at 2.5%, you're already in a bad place if you have
Without
to
adding
add,
heads, yeah.
if you have to add more teachers. You know, if your healthcare costs are growing at more than 2.5%, and we've been told to plan 8 to 10%, so, you know, obviously a massive shift. And as we all know, right, there's few transportation options, and I want to say our last contract increased at 6%, if I'm
Around there.
looking at Ellen, right,
3
somewhere
year.
around there, right?
3 year
And
increase.
so, if you're, as we look ahead, if we can't contain our costs to somewhere around a 2.5 to 3% world, you
Right.
automatically, if we need an override or have to make cuts in another couple of years.
Regularly.
Regularly,
regularly,
yeah.
yeah, it's not, yeah, that's what I was trying to.
So-
Every other district is in the same
Right,
boat, every other
right. I
town's
mean,
in the
just
same
the way
boat.
the funding works.
I think I haven't looked at the numbers of children in other towns, but it seems we've been maybe in a uniquer spot in
Yeah,
terms of
right.
enrollment growth, school enrollment growth over the past, 15 years. So we probably feel it more than a lot of other towns, because a lot of towns in Massachusetts are shrinking in terms of their youth population. We're definitely not.
Right.
So in the interest of moving on to other things on the agenda, because
I
I
was gonna
think
say, I
we're
have to
done.
bail, I apologize.
Yeah.
So, and I know Judy has a hard stop at 11:30 anyway. I think, because we didn't have this up for a vote, at the very least, we have, I think, some consensus around the table that we can get to Lisa's number and below, because there's sort of two ways to go. Different things I've heard around the table. One is, we take all the suggestions Judy has proposed, which gets us under Lisa's by almost $71,000. If we accept the reductions on the reading side, but even bank that elementary position until we really know who's coming for kindergarten, where there is some variability, as Judy has said before, we've transitioned now to this full day, a real full day K model. And that, in some respects, has made it almost harder to predict, because we think some folks really held their kids out last year. So we're kind of waiting to see if those who are redshirted are going to come in a wave. If we do that, if we bank that, we're still under the town manager's number by almost $11,000. So we're at and below Lisa's number, either $10,000 or $70,000. It's kind of where it seems we are. And that, what I would suggest is for our next meeting on March 5th, if anybody has any questions between now and then, be reaching out to Judy, and then we need to be in a position to actually vote a number. But in terms of your modeling, is this helpful?
Definitely.
We're gonna put those.
We hear 70.
Yeah, we're gonna put.
I know you heard that.
we're gonna put. I think
I was
the
thinking.
the top line number is, I don't know exactly what it shook out to. You have 54 million and change, right? A little over 54 million.
Yeah.
Put that into our model and see what 2021 looks like. Because, like I said, I don't.
And we may be able to give you some feedback before your next Tuesday meeting of how tight are we in 21 and 22.
Right.
That'd be
To
great.
help you then think through your priorities.
And we want to make sure that we have all the other departments
Yeah.
accurate as well, and you know, because if it shows we're still a little over 8 million next year, that puts us kind of in a bind. You know, it puts the whole town in a bind, because it'd be really hard to go to taxpayers and say, you know, we need more. It didn't work out after raising their taxes pretty substantially.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. It's good.
Thank you very much.
guys
Thank
very
you,
much.
Guys.
Thank you. All right, so next item, which will actually be pretty quick under superintendent's evaluation, I just want to follow up. I've sent everyone some information a few days ago in terms of superintendent goals. Judy had presented some initial goals, and then she followed up with us on her progress at an early February meeting. So I just sent you links to that. It's all on Google Drive, as well as a evaluation tool that's published by DC. So you have that. I've made some requests to you in terms of when I'd like to get feedback from you so I can begin putting that together. But this was really an opportunity for Judy to take a couple of minutes to speak to her plan around having some evidence available for us and how she'll make it available, as you've done in the past. So we just haven't really talked about this
Sure.
with the full committee.
So, a couple of things on evaluation. Thank you in advance for the time you'll put in to give me feedback for improvement. That's really helpful. The rubric that the DESC has developed for superintendent evaluation is a new rubric. There's a new one for teachers as well that we are sort of negotiating when we'll start to use it. It's slightly changed from the past rubric. So if you could look at that closely, because the feedback should relate directly to the categories in the rubric, and suggestions for improvement in relation to those categories as well. So that's helpful. In the past, what I've done is I've had a Google folder and I've dumped a lot of stuff in there in terms of evidence. And what I've tried to do is give you things that I think you may not always be privy to that will be helpful to you. For example, leadership team agendas or a retreat agenda, or some of the other outside committees I serve on or chair, minutes, so you can look at that. What I don't want to do is create this monstrosity for you to look at. It would be helpful if you would think about, after you look at the rubric, what don't you know about my effectiveness, and what other additional information would you like? What examples of documentation? And then let me know so I can kind of put together the evidence folder in a way that'll be helpful to you. If I've done my job, you know pretty well what I need to do to improve and what I'm doing well. You have a good sense. We've communicated effectively, and I've given you lots of stuff. But if there are things that you just, particularly if you're new to the committee, don't have a good handle on, especially after you look at the rubric, that would be helpful to me. Before I start doing this complete data dump and having you look at all these things you don't really want to look at. I don't know if anyone has actually ever looked at it before.
Yeah.
Some people have.
Not
I was
all,
actually-
but
I was
I'll grant
actually-
you not all of it.
I was
I
just
just
going to
put
make the point that whenever Judy starts putting stuff in her folders, and she may do it in 2 or 3 steps, when she sends out the link and says, I have this for you, I will ask everyone, at least just click on it and be sure it's visible to you. You don't have to read it all at that moment, because she's got different file types and things that you've shared in the past. And in the past, other school committee members have had difficulty getting things to open properly through Google Docs. So at the 11th hour, it's not a good time to say, oh, Dr. Evans, by the way, all that stuff you sent, I can't read it.
I can't open
So
it.
as soon as she's got something posted, just be sure you can open it, that's all, and then let her know if you can't.
That'd be helpful, thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions about that? Thank you, Judy. So under action items, we have approval of minutes from February 5th. I didn't see any suggestions for changes.
Or did I?
So I'm happy to take a motion.
I move your
I gotta have a motion.
I'm like,
What do you want to do with them, Zan?
I move to approve the minutes of February 5th, 2019 as presented.
Second?
All in favor? Aye. And then 2 grant approvals. So is Jen speaking to these?
Enka reading professional development, Jen, if you want to just summarize what that is.
Sure, there, as we talked about before, we're working more with the reading and writing workshop model. I look forward to our opportunity to come back and talk about that, where our kindergartners tell you they're so excited to be readers, even when they can't decode yet, because they see reading as something new. And understanding the skills that go with that. The teachers are also looking to bring in more books that follow students' interest, and as always, constantly trying to bring in some more diversity in our reading materials. So they wrote a grant to INCA for books, and that was approved. And we will also have some more INCA grants from this round coming to you next meeting. We received some other grants too, so thank you to INCA.
So I guess the 2484 is for the book portion.
the books.
And
It's
the
not,
5,000.
it's not for personal services,
It's not for professional development, it's for actually.
given the
for
conversation we
books.
just
Correct,
had.
it's for books.
Yes.
Right, it's just for books.
We're still relying
Yep.
on.
That was Whiffy's contribution is to the professional development piece around this. So
I'll let Karen know you acknowledged her.
thank you.
Do you want to take these separately, or do you want to vote on the first one first?
I can go either way. Is there a motion to accept with gratitude the gift from the Inca Society for $2,484 for reading professional development as presented?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So now, the second one.
Second grant is for Cambridge, from Cambridge Hospital for $1,500. Does we have any background information on this one?
I don't actually know anything about this. I'm assuming this one went through Jason.
No, this is the EHS grant. I
Okay.
believe. It's an annual grant, $1,500 that the district participates in. The $1,500 goes towards professional development for the nurses.
I think, I'm not, it might be sub-coverage for their professional development?
Yes.
Yes.
Sub-nurses are expensive.
Happy to take a motion.
So I move that we accept with gratitude the grant from Cambridge Hospital or the gift from Cambridge Hospital for $1,500 as presented.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. The bulk of my chair report was just going to talk about the meeting last night. We already did that. So I would just say FinCom's been working really hard. I really respect and appreciate all the time that the leadership folks have put into this, because there were 15 members at the table last night, many of whom were not at the select board meeting when they voted the $8 million figure, weren't watching it on TV. And it's clear to me that Nicole, Aaron, and Sam and Roger are doing a great job sort of bringing everybody up to speed, talking about consequences and so forth. So they're doing a tremendous amount of work. And only because I feel like we talk about boys hockey a lot in Winchester, I'll put in a plug that the girls varsity hockey team is playing tomorrow night against the 17th ranked Archbishop Williams team at 6 o'clock at Woburn, in case anybody wants to go root for the Lady Sachems. They are in the playoffs. That's all I had.
Don't they call themselves Lady Sachems? Lady Sachems?
That's what they call themselves, yes.
That's just cool.
Just have one thing on the superintendent's report. I'm planning to, there's a meeting tonight on the town master plan that I've been invited to.
Oh, yeah.
Are you?
Yeah.
I'll be there.
And I will be there. We'll
I'll
bring
be there
back
too.
some
Susan too.
Hey,
embarrassment of.
what would I do on an evening?
Let's all go.
There
Let's
was
make
no
it a party.
meeting.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you. So we do have need for a
Can I
brief,
ask a-
I'm sorry, yeah,
A quick
question? Yeah.
Just so would
Oh, thank you for, sorry.
clarity. I know I reached out to you. The town has decided to all email me about next year's calendar. And I've gotten every email I think possible.
Well, it
Now
would
my
be nice
que-
if one person would email me.
Now my question for you is, on 122, we approved the calendar. And what we approved on 122 was sort of the backbone of the calendar.
The start and end date.
Start and
kinda,
end dates,
right.
the vacations.
Right.
What people are reaching out to me now is, now there is another calendar listed as approved calendar 122 that has all of the other details filled in. It has the
Conference dates.
conference dates, it has the professional development half days, and that is also listed as 120, approved 122. So when people are reaching out to me and saying, what have you guys approved? And I said, well, we approved X. But they're coming back to me saying, well, I see that we've got these dates here and these dates here and these dates here. So I feel like it would be helpful to have some reach to the camera to say where we're moving forward on the calendar and whether what we need to do to finalize
Right.
the calendar.
So
Those are both on the website?
No, only one. Only the most recent one is on the website, correct, Frida?
I believe it's just
Just the one that has the conference days
the
added.
new conference
Then-
days.
okay.
So here's the complicated,
Mhm.
everything's always complicated, it's never a short answer.
The real one.
So, the teachers' union has tentatively agreed to start earlier than their contract requires in order to have a longer break, in December, January. However, that MOA has not yet been signed, but I expect it to be signed very shortly. And then once that has been signed by Chris and Anna, then I will send a direct email to parents and say, yes, we've got final approval on this. I was reluctant to send that sort of, here's the link with all of the conference days and other changes before the MOA was signed. And so that's the only hiccup. It's not that I anticipate any issues with it. The other change this year is that in contract negotiations, rather than having a full week off for the conferences, we've spread them out so that it's several weeks in a row, one day. So we had some other changes to the calendar that were related to negotiations that we just wanted to be sure worked for everybody. And so we made a few final tweaks. So I expect very shortly to send something out to parents, but they can rely, as long as the MOA is signed, this is the accurate calendar that appears on the website.
But just to underscore Brian's point, the calendar that we actually saw and approved on January 22nd is the only calendar that should be on the website that says approved January 22nd. And if there is more information that then goes on the calendar in terms of conference dates and other things, as we've done in the past, we vote a calendar that has a beginning and an end date, and then if there's more information, it comes back to us, we discuss it, and then we vote it and we share it. I think that's where some of the confusion is coming from.
So a couple things,
Right?
and I think.
Is that not where the confusion
I have
is?
people reaching out to me saying, so you guys approved the calendar on 1/22, and I responded to them with the calendar, we respond saying, well, we haven't finalized X, Y, and Z, and they
Right,
said, well,
right.
it says you approved it on 1/22.
Okay, so a couple thoughts on this. There's no requirement for you to vote on the calendar at all, really.
Right.
However, it's been our practice to vote on the calendar, so when we sent the it has been your practice to vote. And so a lot of things govern the calendar, that including collective bargaining agreements, that's the biggest influence, and the DESE's requirements. And so the practice in the past has been, we've just come to you once with a calendar that was mostly right, but because this year we had some changes as a result of the negotiations, I apologize if there was any miscommunication. I thought I said at the time that you're going to vote this calendar, we're going to fill in the other dates, and then we're going to publish it. I wasn't intending to bring it back for a second vote.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right.
That we agreed to that.
Right. And even in the end, should there be some weather catastrophe next year, there could be changes to the last day of, there are always changes at the end piece of the calendar anyway, or it could even be changes around graduation if we really ran into a tough spot on weather-related issues next year. So what we should have taken off is the school committee approved date.
Yeah, you
when we
changed
changed the, because you did approve in general the calendar, we just
Exactly.
tweaked a few conference bits. And so in general, once it's all set, I send it directly to parents and say, here it is, and I just haven't done that piece because we haven't signed the MOA. So,
Well, and I
so
think
apologize for
people
that.
in the community are just trying to plan
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
this.
I am too.
Yeah. Oh.
Right, right.
Okay, thank you for reminding me about that, Brian. Okay, so we have a need for a very fast executive session to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining for units B, C, and D, since discussion in an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on bargaining or litigation position of the school committee. And we need a roll call vote. I've already reviewed next meeting dates.
Aye.
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 Thank you.
Okay,
All right.
thank you. All right. Dashing along.